This is an area that is really quite interesting, and it's a bit paradoxical. This question of a quote unquote dark side of meditation. Ultimately, there is no dark and no light in our practice. There is simply practice, and is direct experience of the practice. So we're going to be looking a bit here into what is it that we experience to be challenging and difficult, what we might call sort of the shadow that arises in meditation. How might we understand those kinds of difficulties, and what are the causes and the conditions that not only lead to suffering, but also the alleviation of suffering in our practice? Because, it's not always this easy, blissful, rosy process. And we're not guaranteed that meditation is something that will always make us feel impeccable and wonderful and blissful, right? So, but that doesn't mean it's not worth doing, nor does it mean that the point of meditation is to suffer, but rather than to change our relationship to the suffering that arises, so that we can build a deeper rootedness and capacity to really make meditation available as often as we can in any circumstance. Yeah. So we're training with what is challenging, not seeking to eradicate it. No mud, no lotus, right? And that's easy for me to say. I've been practicing for decades, and it's there are still things that I notice that come up in my meditation. Usually, if I'm going into retreat, solitary retreat, there is a layer of sort of caked on momentum from busyness, from stress, from things of this world that kind of appear. They just kind of become more apparent. And so there is a settling that happens there, no matter how much maybe I practice on a regular basis or don't practice in some cases. So this is a very, very human theme that we're looking at tonight. Very human. And also that which can transform our being human. That's kind of how I'm approaching this theme. Okay, here's a serene fellow. So this is our theme, meditation. Is there a dark side? And I thought, it's better to phrase this as a question than as a statement. The dark side. Well, let's see how that turns out, because we may want to think of things perhaps a little differently near the end. And I have two fundamental questions that we can hold as we look at these things together. And the first is it the practice itself? Is it practice? Is it meditation? Or is it what we bring into the practice that can feel dark? That's the first one. I'm not going to answer that now, but it's an open question. The second one is, what is the nature of the guidance that we need to skillfully learn from the practice? So in essence, we have sort of two themes here. One is, what is it that we might call darkness or the shadow? And the second is, what is it that we need to be able to cultivate skillfully with whatever arises in meditation? Perhaps teaching of a teacher, a guidance of a community, whatever it might be, the support that helps us with our practice when we start feeling like it's too challenging. Our window of tolerance begins to decrease. And another thought here, kind of how we think about meditation practice, is perhaps seeing it as an invitation to let go. This isn't a definition for meditation necessarily, but it certainly is a part of the process of cultivation of dhyana or shamatha, calm abiding, or insight practice, vipassana or vipassana. We're being invited into a space that's created in which we're starting to deconstruct a bit the things that keep us really bound to our own suffering, to our reactions, and the ways that we're troubled both within ourselves and out in the world. And so we're being invited here. And I really like this term invitation to let go, right? So if we look at the process, just looking at mindfulness, perhaps even the practice that we just did, it begins with the breath. Yeah. We begin basically experiencing what the breath offers us. On the exhale, there is a sense of relinquishing, right? We're opening and hopefully settling and feeling a little more at ease as we breathe out, a nice sort of exhale and then breathing in and openness and such. We get in touch with the sensory body and then the physical body. So we're sort of attuning. We can think of it more as attuning to that which is imminently present, our breath, the body itself, and the present moment, which all of which we did in our practice just now. Very important. This comes from the Buddha and the mindfulness teaching. Contemplating breath, contemplating the body, and also being really rooted in the truth, which is the present. And then we continue on and continue to contemplate feelings, Vedana, feelings in the form of agitation or calm, heaviness or lightness, qualities, feeling qualities that are also part of the sensory body. And yes, there may be emotions in that, but usually emotions are left to mind, the category of mind, not to worry about where emotions land in the picture, but feeling states that then lead us to inquiring, what is the nature of my thoughts? How am I relating to those thoughts? So we just did that practice, mindfulness of our own mind, and sort of seeing the nature, the impermanent nature of our thoughts and so on. And then seeing into the nature of what we call the five hindrances in mindfulness practice, the things that we all experience. Maybe some of you experience these things. We're going to look at those in a moment. But these are common obstacles that arise in our practice that really make it hard to meditate, much less have confidence in the practice. So far, so good. These are all experiences that we have when we begin practicing and then continue practicing. And so the idea here is that all of this is leading us to a relaxed, focused, clear mind of stability and equanimity, the sense of neutral engagement, evenness of mind with no preference. Thought is thought. It doesn't matter if it's good or bad. It's just thought. It's energy, right? And insight that then arises out of these foundations of relaxation, focus, clarity, stability, equanimity, and finally the space arises where we begin to see the nature of things much more clearly. We begin to have realizations and insights. And so then wisdom arises when we can experience this letting go not as loss, but as freedom. Letting go not as loss, but as freedom. This is the truth of it, and yet it doesn't always feel like this. So the question now is, what can possibly go wrong? It all sounds pretty good, doesn't it? It sounds very straightforward. If we look at that last slide, this is the path, to quote unquote letting go, relinquishing all that causes us to suffer, the three unwholesome roots or three poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion. We can maybe see those and we can let go. So I'm going to ask you all of this. What can go wrong? What happens for you in your practice, despite the teachings and kind of the process of meditation that we looked at, just this very kind of simple, basic outline? What have you found goes wrong when you practice, if anything goes wrong? Maybe your practice is always sublime. And if that's the case, I have two responses. Number one is good for you, and number two is just wait. Keep going. So feel free to chime in and say, what is it that you have noticed that obstructs the process, that you find challenging, that is difficult in something that seems so simple when we simply outline it in this way? Okay, so to continue this question that perhaps could be phrased a little more skillfully, I'm going to be drawing here on a few different sources. One is Chris Mace, who wrote a book called Mindfulness and Mental Health. He's a psychologist and mindfulness teacher. I used to use the book in the extension school class and got constant complaints that it was too dry and too clinical, so I stopped using it. But it's still a great resource. So some of this information is from his research, as well as Willoughby Britton, who's at Brown University, who's written quite a bit about trauma and mindfulness and just some of the things to be aware of. David Trelevin, who wrote a great book called Trauma Sensitive Mindfulness. And then Alice Walton, who's a writer who also writes a bit about the benefits of meditation practice on the brain and the neurophysiology. And I think there may be one or two other things. So one of the things that the studies have shown is that, you know, the adverse effects, if you will, of meditation that are pretty commonly reported. And one is discomfort. How many of us has felt discomfort? And by discomfort, we're talking about just getting used to a meditation posture, you know, sitting in a certain way, you know, maybe sitting upright. And if you're like me and you're a sloucher, it's like, oh, now I'm sitting up straight and my back's hurting. You know, it took me a while to learn how to sit in Padmasana, the lotus position on a cushion, and strengthening the core belly, you know, so that I can sit now for hours without needing support in the back and so on. So that's one of the things that's reported, is just the discomfort that comes with practice. The other thing is sort of a reluctance to seeing the negative aspects of oneself. That there is almost a fear of encountering the things that one either doesn't like about oneself, or that you know, feeling feelings that one doesn't want to feel, and so on and so forth. A lot of these have to do with people who are pretty much beginners. Yeah. I think as we gain capacity in meditation, some of these things tend to resolve and we just sort of keep on going, but not always. Sometimes discomfort appears. I broke my leg when I was younger. I was in Mexico and I broke my leg there, and I have probably an alignment issue in my left leg from that accident, that when I sit in meditation posture, my left leg always falls asleep. It is just relentless. And not just falling asleep and then it's fine, but we're talking about seriously dead weight on the left side of my body here, so that I need to adjust sometimes by putting a cushion under the knee and raising it and releasing the pressure. So that's that kind of discomfort. All of us maybe have something, perhaps at some point, that we work with in our practice that we need to adjust for. Another reported negative aspect is a feeling of failure to live up to the expectations that either we have of ourselves in practice, or that our teachers or our communities have for us. And this is very commonly said is, and failure here is in quotes because, as we know, there is no such thing as failure in practice, in Dharma, or in this. It's more a matter of learning and cause and effect, creating the conditions that are auspicious for feeling a sense of benefit for the practice and so on. But nonetheless, in our culture, we have this notion of success and failure. And so this is something that often comes up. Losing cherished things. Oh no, if I meditate, I'm going to start not wanting the things that I really want now. I'm going to be different than I am. And I'm not going to enjoy playing the guitar anymore, which hasn't happened, I can tell you. This doesn't necessarily have to happen. But that is a concern that people have. And this next one I really like. According to the studies that were done, intolerance of others who do not practice. This is actually a thing, right? This is reported, self-reported. In essence, it's easy for us to get judgmental about other people who don't practice or who have no interest in it. Yeah. The next one is an increased awareness of unpleasantness. And as maybe we've learned by now in our practice, when we show up onto the cushion, we may not be noticing all of the stuff that we're carrying. Yeah. And then we start to sit, we breathe, the mind settles. And now all this stuff is being revealed to us. Now, some people say, oh, meditation causes me to feel fear, or it causes me to ruminate. And yet, what we don't know is we've already been doing that. We've already been ruminating. We've already been maybe having a sense of anxiety or fear. We're now more aware of it. And that's the whole point. But this can also be something that causes some aversion to the practice. We don't want to look or feel negativity. After all, if we're engaging in meditation, we're probably doing it so that we can feel better. This is how I learned about meditation all the way back in 91, 92, was looking for a way out of my anxiety and this sense of depression that I was living with in my, like around 2021, when I was in my early 20s. And so in a way, it's like the power of necessity. We come to it because we're looking for a way out, and we don't want to feel samsara anymore in the way that we do, perhaps. So not feeling the benefits. So what then? I need to feel good. I need this to make me feel a certain way, or now I'm really hopeless. I'm really lost. So I need to have some outcome. If I've been struggling through my whole whatever 20-minute or 30-minute practice or longer, and I get up and I feel agitated, it's not going to bode well for my practice, at least in my mind. And so there can be this resistance if we're not actively feeling like it was worth doing. Perhaps a little more of a serious one are coping strategies. I added this. This isn't from the literature. And I've watched myself years ago looking at the deconstruction of coping strategies that were there for a long time so that I could function, so that I could deal with life and so on. Coping strategies, what we might also call defense mechanisms, attachment issues, whatever it is, that we come face to face through the intimacy that meditation allows for with the things, as I think, Michael, you said, they just don't serve us well anymore. So when we talk about the invitation of letting go, now we're starting to look more at some of those things that maybe have served us so that we can function and maintain and protect ourselves. But now we're having to come face to face with those things. Also, as Leah said, with the bypassing, if we're like, hey, this feels good, I'm just going to go with the good feeling only and steer it, control the process, I don't have to look at those things. And yet, out of sight, again, is not out of mind. So sometimes people report, discomfort. I think that that's one of the sort of more visceral forms of discomfort that we experience. The hindrances, nivaranas, or this is a Pali term for the five hindrances, which we'll look at in a moment. These are, I think the word nivarana, I think I saw Tajay on this call, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that term means covering up, that which covers up. In fact, the Buddha teaches the five hindrances in the 10th discourse on mindfulness, that these, as part of vipassana or insight, attachment, aversion, sloth, torpor, restlessness, and doubt are things that really can hang us up in our practice. And doubt is the worst of those five, just based on all these other factors. And that's really, this lack of confidence in the practice, or lack of a feeling that this is even possible for me, or that there's any truth to the teachings, and so on and so forth, all part of doubt or confusion. That can really cause us to feel perhaps even more challenges about ourselves, self-criticism, and all of that. So, and then the last thing here that I have listed is, and I think maybe Jane mentioned this, a history of trauma that often surfaces in meditation in one form or another. Now, this is not an exhaustive list. There are other things as well. We're going to look here at some causes for some of these things, and here the sort of the malady of the five hindrances are also the causes for challenges in meditation. Some of you have probably already learned the five hindrances, but largely these obstacles that arise sometimes in every practice, sometimes all five arise at once. Isn't that lovely? The first one being attachment or sensual desire, which really is more about craving or kind of needing a stimulus hit. Yeah. If you've ever started to settle and then there's this like resurgence of craving for that chocolate, or, sometimes it's sexual energy that arises for people. This is very normal, very natural. And it's that part of us that is seeking to go out and seeking that stimulus, seeking something pleasurable here. The second hindrance is aversion, or what's called ill will, or negative states that we reject. So that arises too. Things like the discomfort is coming up. I don't want to experience this. I start ruminating about someone in my life that I don't care for. Yeah. But basically resistance or negative reactions to certain things, including our own thoughts and our own feelings. So sloth, torpor, or laxity. How about this one? Does anyone ever get sleepy or drowsy when you're meditating? What we call the elephant stuck in a rut. Everyone ever feel that? You're just, checking out, you're heavy, and so on and so forth. And that can also get in the way. It obfuscates our practice. And then on the other side of that is what we often call the monkey mind, the restlessness, the agitation, anxiety. That sense of just the mind is not giving you a break. It's not an option, and it's just spinning with thoughts and all of that agitation. And sometimes the monkey is riding the elephant. That's a lovely experience when we get both together as a set. And then the fifth one is doubt. The fifth one is when all is said and done, all of these four, I'm exhausted and I don't think I can do this. Yeah, it's like losing that sense of inspiration and possibility with the practice. So that cause can be the source of inner conflict, and we may struggle with these things until we realize that each of these hindrances resolve themselves. We just need to put them into perspective as they arise, and not take the bait. We'll talk a little bit about perhaps how that works. But the next one is judgment. Just not being able to let go of this judgmental sort of sense of these filters of judgment onto ourselves, onto others, onto experiences. Good, bad, positive, negative, worthy, unworthy, pleasant, unpleasant. We get caught up here, especially in the attachment and the aversion part of it. So that can be a cause for some of these things, like irritation at people who don't practice. We're judging, right? We're in that judgy kind of thing. Our expectations for practice, impatience. I'm not having the experience I want to have. I sat down so that I could have this experience. Or, wow, when I was on retreat last week, I had a wonderful experience. I think I can make that happen again. Or I want this to happen again, or it needs to happen again, And of course, then that sets up a real sort of an obstacle here to actually having the experience, but a fresh version of it in this moment, as opposed to what I was experiencing when I had that experience the first time. And so then, of course, impatience. Just, again, this is part of that fourth hindrance, that sense of I need this now. Maybe I only have 20 minutes until I have to go to work or whatever. But the need for things to happen in a way that is gross level, sensory, and quick. And these things we may not even be aware that are arising. Sense of control. I have a friend who is a lama who very openly talked about how she just felt like she wasn't making any progress while she was in training as a Tibetan Buddhist lama, until she realized that she was using meditation as a control. It was there, she was using it to control her experiences, her feelings about life, and all of this stuff. And once she realized that, the light switch went on. And she was able to sort of relinquish all of that striving and that trying that gets in the way. Another way to call this is non-allowing. Basically, making it happen, not allowing it to happen. There's a real difference in how we're relating to our practice. Basically, allowing meditation to work us, as opposed to us working the meditation. Does that make sense? Letting meditation just indicate what the practice needs to be. There are so many times where I've started a practice or started off a solitary retreat thinking, here's what I'm going to do, here's how I'm going to enter in, I'm going to do my, the chanting and the practice and all these sadhanas, and then I sit down and it's like, dude, because that's what I call myself sometimes, you need to do this. Now it happens immediately. So I try not to put all of those sort of expectations on it. But early on, I had to learn, this isn't necessarily what I should be doing here. Rather, listening to the practice and seeing, okay, what's going on in me right now? How do I enter into this space and what's in the way? And interestingly, working doing deity meditation has been really important to sort of initiate the space and begin retreat. Leah mentioned this, spiritual bypass, exactly. Avoiding the feeling states. And this can cause a whole host of things. In fact, if we're not paying attention to what is really going on within our emotions, within our affective life, we may struggle with meditation for a long, long period of time and not know why it's difficult. In fact, for me, it's like whenever the mind is just doing whatever it's doing and it is simply relentless, rather than work with thoughts, I drop into my heart. What is going on? what is the feeling state that is sort of blowing the roof off of the house here? And always, always, there is where the answer is. And it's like the mind is simply sort of a I don't know, a reactor to kind of the fuse that is within the heart. So it's so important to pay attention to what is really this feeling state, as opposed to just, why am I thinking this thought? Well, what am I feeling this thought to be? And then awakening a sense of loving kindness or some compassion for the suffering that I'm noticing within the heart. And usually that tends to then start to change the nature of thinking. Not always, but in general. Anyway, I couldn't do that if I were just ignoring or avoiding where my heart is. You know? The other cause that we look at, these are common, are inadequate guidance or training. Here's wrong again. I am sorry for those of you who don't like this this qualifier. Wrong practice, wrong time. And really, when I'm talking about wrong here, I'm talking more so about skillful means or a lack of it. In other words, if I have a teacher and they say, here's what we need to be practicing, what you need to be practicing is this, here's how you must train. And this is traditional in Buddhist traditions, in many meditation traditions, yoga, Vedanta, all of these other traditions as well. But without that guidance, without that training, we may be introduced to a practice that isn't necessarily what we need to be practicing. And this is why a teacher matters, or why instruction and study matters, to know where we are on the map, on the GPS, and to know how to sort of get the most out of this mapping of in terms of where we're headed. So it may not be this is the best practice for us. I've seen people who've been stuck and mired in a practice and they're getting no benefit out of it whatsoever. And usually my question at that point is, maybe there's another practice that you're ready to do that helps you feel vitality, that helps you feel on this path that you're actually progressing somewhere with it. Or maybe the timing isn't right for doing this practice. Maybe revisiting this practice. For me, the practice of Tonglen, the compassion meditation of sending and receiving, when I was learning it initially, it was totally the wrong time to be practicing that. And when I say wrong time, it was not the auspicious time to practice it. I needed to do other things first. But then later on, when I went through a period of real suffering and grief in my life, then the right time appeared and I got just immeasurable benefit out of the practice. And then that's when I began teaching it. So this is what I mean by time, practice, and so on. A few more common causes. Misperceiving the teachings. This is from the literature, from the study, from Chris Mace's book. If we aren't fully understanding the teachings, we may practice it in a way in which it wasn't taught or meant to be practiced. And this is why studying the texts, learning, having conversation with a community or a teacher, that our perception of the practice itself and what we're doing with it is really sort of rooted in accuracy. This is why lineage preservation has been so seriously implemented for thousands of years around the teachings, so that we're really getting it right. And that includes the translators, some of whom maybe haven't even done the practices. And then a little bit of a mistranslation because of a lack of experience may mean that then we're reading a book and we're not quite getting the essence of what the original teachers were going for. Anyway, this is something that we can't always avoid, perhaps, in that context, but we strive to find accuracy in the teachings so that benefits our practice and we can practice more skillfully. Another one that I personally have encountered have to do with medications, interestingly. So when I was doing chaplaincy for cancer patients at Dana-Farber and Brigham and Women's Hospital here in Boston. I did that full time for 5 years. It didn't take long to realize that people who were on steroids, often for people in chemotherapy that will be on steroids, so to override the body's natural resistance to the toxicity of the chemicals within the chemotherapies. So they basically are trying to override the body's rejection of the chemotherapies so that the body can take in to kill the cancer. And so that's what the steroids do, is they sort of help the body bypass that whole thing. Well, another outcome of steroids is your mind gets hyperactive at night, and then you get sleepy during the day, apparently. I've never been on steroids, but this is what I heard from lots and lots of people. And if they're learning how to meditate and they're sitting at home alone at night and they're on steroids, and their mind, they're basically struggling, not against their mind, but against the drug. That's really important for them to know. And so I always would ask, that would be one of the questions, are you on any medication that either makes your mind hyper or drowsy? Because that has to be a factor in your awareness if you're struggling, so that you don't think, I can't meditate, there's something wrong with me. So that's something that can also, we want to check in with as well. Is it something that makes us drowsy? Is it the monkey mind or the elephant mind? Here's an interesting one. This is something that I've been developing. There is a term in clinical psychology, especially applied to panic disorder and anxiety disorders, called extinction bursts. We've talked about this in our class, I think both classes at the Extension School this semester. And what we find in things like panic disorder is that there can be an arousal within the nervous system as fear begins to mount. And anybody who's I used to have panic attacks when I was younger, and I know what they're like firsthand. And you begin this process of heightened discomfort, unease, and it keeps growing and growing and going up this mountain until you hit the peak of panic. And this is the place where you think you're losing your mind. Right before it comes down, it dissipates, and you feel a little bit of a relief. And then here it comes again. Yep. It starts mounting again. It goes up to another peak. And then usually that peak is right before it comes down again. So these are what are sometimes called extinction bursts of panic, of fear, of the psyche kind of snowballing the fear into a maximum level of arousal until you level out. What I've been doing with this term, and I think it's a great term to apply to meditation practice and what the ego experiences when we start to really settle, when we start encountering this sense of spaciousness, of consciousness, of awareness, in which the I is no longer the primary agent. Yeah. The ego fears its dissolution. It fears its death. It's that part of us that fears dying the most. Not all of us fears our death, but the ego does. This process we call ego that includes our conditioning, our emotional bodies, our pain bodies, our fears, and all of these things. And not all of us feels those things. But the ego, right before we have a deepening of meditation practice, sometimes what happens is the ego is throwing everything at you because it needs to stay alive. It needs to be valid. And so the fear of this dissolution means that, if you think about sort of the Buddha's awakening and what we call Mara in Buddhism, this sort of nemesis of the Buddha, constantly trying to undermine his confidence in his awakening, in his awareness, in his accomplishment. Of course, the Buddha's not having any of it, right? He's now awake. But this is what the ego, it shows up as this Mara. It's not evil. It's not sort of morally somehow bankrupt. It's simply seeking survival, just like any other consciousness state is. And so it throws everything but the kitchen sink at you, and sometimes the kitchen sink comes along too. The key is not to take the bait. Don't take the bait. Because on the other side of all of that stuff is usually a deepening of your meditation. But these extinction bursts of the ego can really be, they can really hang us up. They can obfuscate the entire practice. And then we get mired back in the samsara of our own suffering. So that's another cause for the pitfalls. And it really is the home of what we might call the shadow side or the dark side of our practice. It's tied into the limbic system, the reptilian brain, the fight, flight, freeze, and now this new fawn category. When we feel threatened in any way. But that's the egoic process, seeking to protect itself, seeking to continue to assert this sense of I and this importance of its existence. The mention here and the whole separate video, and we did an evening, I think last year, on traumatic fear and anxiety in meditation. So we're not going to go into that whole field. You can certainly watch that separately. But it is an important part of this list. PTSD, a trauma history, anxiety issues, or other mental health disorders can arise in what I call fraught silence. Fraught silence. And that is, you're on a retreat, you're practicing for 45 minutes in complete silence, and now all this stuff starts to come up. The silence itself is a container for all of that stuff, and sometimes is where re-traumatization happens. If you have a history of trauma, the silence becomes a fraught place because you're not ready for that yet. And therefore the meditation needs to be tailored. It needs to be adjusted. It doesn't mean you can't practice, but it does need some help. After all, a lot of these traditions we train in assume already a certain amount of mental balance. And so that's important to also keep in mind, that if there are these mental health issues that maybe we've struggled with, that these can be triggered sometimes if we don't have the right guidance relative to our situation. Now, these are all pretty normal. These are all solvable. There are remedies for all of these things, which we can look at in a moment. Where we start finding really some of the more acute outcomes of meditation practice, what we can call the advanced causes of suffering or of a quote unquote dark side. Most of these more acutely negative effects occur during more intensive practice. These are people who they're no longer, they're progressing on the path. They're spending much longer times in practice, long-term retreats perhaps. And this is where we start to see in some people things that need to be sort of held with awareness. So when we look at these advanced causes, often it happens during intensive retreats where there are extensive periods of silence. We have sort of allowed the practice to settle us deeply, more deeply, so that deeper layers of held pain, grief, loss, trauma, things like that begin to unearth as part of the letting go process. Remember, when we began, we were talking about letting go. And so this invitation to let go, of course, will also go more deeply the further we go. So we need support around this, right? If you're doing this all by yourself and you don't have a teacher, you don't have a community of people who have already been through it, then you can find yourself in some trouble. So what we can call the deeper dissolutions, deeper sense of identification with who I am, who this I, Chris, is, the sense of ego. The extinction bursts can go more deeply in a way. A sense of personality, a way of seeing the world, a way of showing up, deeper coping strategies, self-identifications, things like that, even things like self-worth and, really kind of unearthing and transforming ourselves sometimes at that advanced level can come with what is called the dark night of the soul in some cases. Shingen Jung, teacher, calls the pit of the void, or what we might call the shadow. Yeah, this is why we need support on the path at that point as well. Psychophysiological practices. And this is maybe some of you have run across this, if not once, occasionally, or many times. There's a term called Kundalini crisis. And this is where people who are doing very extensive, subtle physiology practices, working with energies, working with the energy channels, the chakras, doing tantric practices where the sexual fluids are retained and then circulated through the body for awakening. At the heart of those experiences are the seeds of enlightenment, after all, both men and women, and binary. So what can happen if you're not gently practicing these things, or for some people who have a very sort of powerful will and capacity for visualization, is it can overload. Basically, we can think of it as short-circuiting the central nervous system and the autonomic nervous system. The nervous system issues can arise, and there have been such things reported as severe headaches, hallucinations, trembling, shaking, mental breaks, if you will. And so these kinds of practices often need to be done with a teacher, and need to be done in a way where we're allowing things to happen and not forcing them. So often what can happen is somebody may be working so intensively and with so much momentum that they're not aware the degree to which they're actually facilitating a sort of a sped up change, and then everything comes apart a little bit too quickly and with some results. So this is documented. There used to be a hotline. I don't think it's around anymore, though, for people who are having these kinds of crises. And mostly it's people who are practicing on their own, or have had a teacher that maybe hasn't guided them skillfully or attentively enough into their own makeup and how they are sort of relating to the practices. But this is where we see probably more of some of the concerning outcomes. That doesn't mean, though, that it's not leading somewhere. It doesn't mean necessarily that this dark night of the soul isn't part of the clearing. It's just not something we want to have to experience with that kind of intensity, especially if there's no support. I also think that in some cases, psychedelics are sometimes cracking open the capacity of the mind to organize information, to aggregate it in coherence. And so anything that what is called the entropy of the mind, anything that disassembles all of that quickly can lead to panic attacks, fear, things like that, because it happens so fast. There may be a shift that just happens. So anyway, the point being is we want to do this in a setting where we are taken care of, we're being watched, and also, in my opinion, that is ritualized. That is part of a container of some kind of framework that has in an impact beyond just Chris as a closed system, but that he is interrelated, that there is, whether it's Amitabha Buddha or I'm being held in the Brahmajala, the Indra's net, but that there is an ontology or a cosmology supporting this work. We don't want to feel alone, though. That's one of the things here. And then the final category here is something that we're always warned against in the Buddhist teachings. Don't become too attached to the blissful states or the siddhi. Siddhis are sort of abilities that are inculcated in our practice, such as clairvoyance, the capacity to know things or to have direct downloads from the deities and abilities. And these are actually documented. This is not myth or fantasy, that people have abilities that are actually quite normal. We've just lost the connection with a lot of those capacities that are more intuitive based. And so we can, if we start to find that we're just attuning, we're hearing, seeing things that are actually true at a distance, remote viewing, whatever it might be. And these are normal things, and this is not the point of Dharma practice. We don't want to get sucked into, wow, look what I can do. The ego loves it. Look what I can do with this. Yeah, that's not the point. This is why motivation, again, matters. This is for the well-being of easing suffering in any way that is skillful or right. And the same is true for the bliss states in meditation. We can get so attached and drawn in and crave it to such an extent that now we're in a bind because I'm not getting that hit anymore. And now I'm back in sort of this suffering place. All right, so oh my gosh, we're running out of time. I'm going to go quickly through the rest of this, and then we can have some questions. So, what is helpful? What is relief for and I should have put quotes, the darkness here. What is some good advice for us here? Guidance. Find a skillful teacher, or a community that where people have been on the path. What ordains people the most is their level of realization. And so you want someone who has realized enough of the terrain that you're on that can help guide you through it. Discomfort. Here I put minding the balance. And here, what we're talking about is stress tolerance, or a window of tolerance. Discomfort isn't always a bad thing. In fact, a lot of change comes with a little bit of discomfort, going into horizons that maybe we haven't been through before, unfamiliarity, uncertainty. But we want to know when the discomfort needs attention, when we need to balance it with a wise shift in posture, or a practice that will support maybe something that is out of balance, right? So this is what I mean by minding the balance between an appropriate amount of discomfort and an amount of discomfort where it's like, no, something needs to change here because this is not helping. It's what we would call iatrogenic, meaning the treatment makes it worse. So that's what we do if we are able to have that discernment or check in with a teacher and such. Motivation matters. Come back to basic motivation: kindness, gentle awareness, compassion, the attitude of why am I doing this in the first place? We recite the bodhicitta prayer at the beginning to root ourselves back in the fact that we're not doing this alone and just for ourselves, but we're really wanting to benefit the environments that we show up in, and because others will experience that environment through us. And again, this notion of the jeweled net, that each of us is connected in that way. Balancing effort and effortlessness, the allowing. So as we talked about, the striving, the trying, the expectation, the impatience, or the facilitating, the over-facilitating of a practice so that we start feeling a little unbalanced. Practice balancing effort and the allowing if that's all we do, this can take us a long way. Yeah. Also embodying the practice. One of the things about Buddhist meditation specifically is that we are in this human form and we have this great opportunity to practice in an embodied way. So we use the body. In Buddhist meditation, the body is we're always aware that we're in a physical body, and remaining rooted, remaining grounded, remaining stable in the practice. And even in the event of feeling like, wow, my body feels like it's dissolving, or I'm doing somersaults in my head. Jane, you reminded me when you were talking about that. When I first started, I would feel like I was spinning head over heels, and I'd have to open my eyes and focus on something stationary in front of me. I actually learned how to practice open eye meditation because of that, because all of that energy, it was really uncomfortable. And so being in the body, connecting with the rootedness. Again, spiritual bypass. Look at the tendency to avoid working with emotions and affective states. Here we're talking about deep feeling states, ways that we relate to ourselves in the world. In fact, laxity, the hindrance of laxity, of sloth, can sometimes be a clue that we're avoiding. It's a great way to check it. And if we've had enough rest, we've had enough sleep, sometimes you need to sleep instead. But if you've had enough, if you're fairly rested and you start having that experience, check in. What am I avoiding here that's putting me to sleep? Yeah, that doesn't mean this is naturally what's happening, but it may be that's one strategy of avoidance. Patience. Oh my goodness, can't say that enough. And I'm grateful to Michael for saying, I just let the meditation be what it is. I let it show up as it is. Absolutely. That requires some patience and just watching your expectations for your practice on any given day. Really let it be fresh and spontaneous. And just be open to whatever arises. And so much of this is about our relationship with what comes. Yeah. And then, of course, adjust the practice. For people with PTSD, trauma, anxiety, we need to fine-tune the practice so that we're able to practice, or maybe it's just focused on chanting. The Om Ahum, the sadhana that we do in Tibetan Buddhism, that Padmasambhava teaches us, is very, very good as an intermediate practice. In fact, it is a meditation practice. It is a shamatha practice, but it uses the vibration of the mantra, the breath, the sensation, so that we're really engaged with the intention of each of those syllables. So these are the sources that I drew on for the information. This is the sources page. We're sort of at the end here. What are some conclusions? Well, I guess we can maybe share some of that in the last 10 minutes or so. But one thing I think that's very important is, if we're learning meditation in a particular tradition, it's not just about the meditation practice, but it's about all the other stuff that comes with it, the ethics, the study of the texts, the accuracy of what we're getting, right? My go-to is Tajay. Tajay is extraordinary in his capacity. Those of you who've been on the Sutra study Sunday mornings, we look at texts, and he has this wonderful capacity, having been a monk for so long, perhaps, and studying the Pali texts. It really is clarifying, but it also is supportive. It also supports us in our practice. Having a community, basically the entire ecosystem, the more we learn about it, the more we learn about Dharma, the more we learn about the Dharma Dhatu, the ultimate nature of the universe, through the Buddhist lens, the more liberating it can be, because we're part of something really unique, and we're being held by the tradition, by the path itself, and by our friends on the path. So I'm going to stop there.